Coming up on this episode of the Salesman Podcast.
So that means we're really open to experience and to learning as soon as we're born. We little kids imitate like crazy. They do what their parents and their caretakers and siblings do. They don't know any better. They think this is what you're to do. And so they're just constantly soaking up the right and wrong thing to do. Cultural influences in the United States, for example, for a long time, racist kinds of influences are there in the culture. They're there in our popular television shows. And
hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most listened to B2B sales show. If you haven't already, make sure that you click subscribe, join Sales Nation today. And with that, let's meet today's guest.
My name is John Bargh. I'm a professor at Yale University. I've been academic psychologist at NYU and then Yale for over 35 years. I started in the 1970s and was interested in the question of free will. I was interested in the question of what can science tell us about how much free will we really have in our lives. There wasn't any actual science on that, so I started doing that research, and I've written a book about it. The name of the book is Before You Know It, The Unconscious Reasons We Do What We Do. It is on Amazon. It's hopefully at bookstores.
On this episode with the legend that is John, who is a genuine researcher at Yale University, we're diving into unconsciousness, essentially how our conscious reacts with our unconscious or subconscious, how we can manipulate it to improve ourselves and improve our sales performance, and how our unconscious essentially communicates with other people's unconscious without us even realizing. There's a whole lot more. This is an incredible episode. I really enjoyed recording it. I hope you're going to get a lot out of it as well. So let's jump right in. How much of our day-to-day lives, if there's a number that can be put on it, is down to the unconscious rather than what we think that we're doing with our conscious brains?
Absolutely. That is the question. Our unconscious influences are there all the time. They're really in the background guiding what we do consciously. And, people always have this iceberg metaphor for conscious. It's a little bit of top that you can see, and then this huge amount of ice underneath that's unconscious. I don't like that metaphor because it's static. And really what's going on here is this sort of dynamic kind of cyclic kind of thing. I think of dolphins being in the water, but also needing air to breathe and coming out of the water and then going back down in the water in sort of a cyclic kind of manner, because our conscious thoughts and our conscious reasoning and all of that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from unconscious processes. And our unconscious processes largely come from our conscious experiences and our conscious thinking. So the two influence each other very synergistically or dynamically. One influences the other. And a lot of times our conscious experience of how we feel about something comes from our recent experience, our evolutionary kinds of things. The unconscious influences on us often color our interpretations that are made consciously. So it's very interconnected and dynamic and going on all the time.
So I think everyone will be familiar, and it's probably you've probably used this example and you're probably sick of hearing it, of we drive somewhere, we're familiar with the journey, we get there, we're like, oh, holy heck, we've got not paid attention to anything along the way, but we got there safe. With that said, we understand that, John, in perhaps even the business context or in a personnel to a person-to-person context, is there anything we're doing subconsciously which we perhaps misconceive that we think we're doing consciously?
Often what we think we're doing for one reason is really for an ulterior motive. I see that all the time. We all see it all the time in cases that are conflict of interest or corruption or this Me Too movement and all of that, where someone thinks they're doing something that's very normal or very okay to do, and everyone else around them, it smells like dead fish. I mean, it seems like the only person who doesn't get that there's something really wrong here is the person doing it, and yet they're doing it so outwardly and overtly and in public, and it's just amazing. How could this person just do these things so without even trying to hide what they're doing? And it's often because we're not really that aware of our own motivations. We're very aware of the motivations of others. And let me just make that drive that point home in a way that I think will very compelling for all of us. All these intractable conflicts in politics or between two countries and all of that, everyone always thinks that they're being objective and they're being just very calm and cool and collected and objective about the situation. If the other person disagrees with you, they must be motivated, right? Because if they were objective, they see the same way you do. And so when you hear these conflicts, the longstanding ones between nations and or whatever, you often just there's no possible way to talk to the other side because you just so believe you're being objective. And that is because we don't understand or experience our own motivations and how they influence how we are understanding things. But we're very good at experiencing the motivations of other people. And actually, this leads into some interesting things with business and so forth that I'd like to get into. But that to me is the big break, that the divide between people is that we're not aware of our motivations, and yet we're very sensitive to those of other people.
So we'll come on to that in a second, but I've got one final thing that I think will tee up the conversation here, John. This is something that I don't know if this is true or whether I assume it's been studied, but it's how I can contemplate some of this, because we can go down many rabbit holes here, whether it's studiable or whether it's almost like philosophy. But can we think of this almost like we've got the subconscious running in the background, doing all the processing, keeping us alive? Could consciousness then be a way of seeing the reality that's facing us and then almost rationalizing it back to ourselves so we don't go crazy? And in which case, if that's true, is the real, I'm hesitant to ask this question because this is a 4-hour podcast in itself, but is there really free will if that's the case, if all we're doing is rationalizing things?
Yeah, well,
I
yeah,
love
exactly.
the sigh of breath then.
Yeah, well, the thing is, there have been a lot of neuroscience studies on this, hypnotism studies on this, and in general, what people are saying is we're not really aware of the impulse to do things. The signals of what to do are coming from unconscious sources. And our purpose of our conscious mind is to interpret what we're doing and make sense out of it. So it's really, we're building sort of a narrative understanding or story of what we're doing and why. And of course, we're trying to build the most plausible, the most defensible, good version of what we do. And we're doing that for social reasons. That is, when people call us on why we did what we did, we have a good reason. We can argue, we can say, well, I really was trying to do this. It's a very nice, defensible reason. But the standard model of this goes back to William James in American Psychology in the 1800s and others, is that these drives or impulses to guide what we do come from a source that it's not conscious choice. Our conscious mind is what's good at interpreting and building a story and understanding the reasons, but it can often be wrong.
So how much then, and we'll use the example of a negotiation, perhaps a heated B2B negotiation where we both feel like we want to get a win-win out of it. We both feel like we're being, we're not doing the, whether you like him or don't like him for his politics, but we're not trying to Donald Trump someone of kind of go in with all the leverage. So we both think that we're in a good place when we start the negotiation. How much of all of this is two subconsciouses negotiating through our consciousness versus how much of the consciousness is involved between that kind of back and forth process?
Right. This is a great point, great question, Will, because some of these influences are not on how we think, but on how we value things. So we often like somebody, let's say they're physically attractive. This is a big study that was actually done in Italy about 5 years ago with 12,000 job applications to real jobs. And they put photographs on the applications and they manipulated them to be an attractive or unattractive or no photograph. And in the case of women, it was unbelievable. The exact same resume, 57% of the time got called for an interview if it had an attractive photo, 7% of the time with an unattractive photo. Now, the people who are deciding who to interview and hire would say, no, we don't do that. We don't base it on things like just physical attractiveness. And yet the data show that it was a hugely influential thing. But what might be going on is that the brain just activates, the reward centers of the brain just activate when we see attractive people, beautiful scenery, good tasting food. The reward center is lighting up. Well, then we read the application, we have this good feeling, and we misattribute the good feeling to something about the application. Oh, the letters of recommendation, the job experience, the whatever it is. We have the good feeling, and we don't really know the source. So oftentimes in negotiations or whatever it is, we may feel that this is the right thing to do and really good, but not realize that the value of it comes from what it's good for us and what it does for us. And since we're really bad about locating the sources of these feelings, we can misattribute it to the quality of the proposed solution. And both sides do that, and they just can't understand why the other side doesn't see it their way.
Is it possible then, seemingly to then consciously perhaps manipulate our environment so that affects our subconscious, so then we get a feedback loop to better results consciously in our reality?
This is the way to go. This is where everything is moving right now. It's so interesting. People are doing interventions, for example, with obese shoppers who really want to diet and eat healthily. Interventions such as these recipe flyers where you're handed when you go into a grocery store right at the beginning, things like that. And if they have words about dieting and healthy eating, the obese, not the non-obese, only the people who have this goal and desire to eat better, healthily, and diet, buy significantly less snack food. They look at their receipts when they come out of the store. And this was a large-scale store and a study in Holland in actual grocery stores, significantly reduced their purchasing. So these little nudges and budges from the outside world that we're not aware of influencing us, and yet they can influence, and they're being used in these interventions to shape what we do. We can also construct our own environment. This is the tricky thing, Will, is it's the old line about you can't tickle yourself.
Yeah.
If you know you're doing it, I say, I know what I'm putting this I don't know, this photograph of Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King on my wall to make me a better person, to make me more honest or more generous or more selfless, something like that. And you can do that. I think people should do that because you may know it, why it's up there the first day or two, the second day or after a week, 2 weeks, it becomes part of the woodwork. It becomes the background. You'll not be aware of its being up there anymore, and then it might have a real effect.
So how can we do this to improve our performance in a sales and business environment? So, for example, I could throw a couple of things at you, and perhaps we can touch on one that you've got an idea on how we can change. So, one thing that separates high-performing salespeople from low-performing salespeople is the beliefs and values about money. So, people who typically perform well in sales roles are comfortable talking about money. They understand that money doesn't really exist. It's just an exchange of value. People, and this, I'm on the other side of this. I've had to teach this to myself over time, just through repetitions, which hopefully isn't the best way because it's been a real pain in the ass to kind of implement. But I had some weird beliefs about money that stemmed from, I assume this is drilled into my subconscious of my dad, by him saying things like, money doesn't grow on trees, when literally it's made out of paper. It does literally made out of trees. So there's all these weird beliefs that seemingly have been drilled into me at a young age that I'm consciously trying to battle because I know the model of what I'm trying to get to believes this and this, has these values and has these unconscious programs running in the background. So if we stick on that one in particular, perhaps we can dive for a few more. How do you go consciously about reprogram? No, let me start from the beginning. How's your unconscious programmed? Are you born with beliefs, or is it nature or nurture to get these things that are important to us instilled into us?
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot packed into that question. It's certainly nurture in the sense that our evolutionary influences are not specific at all to our culture or even our language. We're not born with a language. We're not born with a culture. You can take any infant at birth, take them anywhere on planet Earth. They will grow up wherever you take them to speak that language perfectly, to have that culture perfectly. And we're all basically sponges and absorb our culture right from birth because there's no way to know what that's going to be in advance. And evolutionary influences come from 100,000, 200,000 years ago. There's no way that the evolutionary influence can predict and anticipate what conditions are going to be like when the person is born. The same genes in all cases. So that means we're really open to experience and to learning as soon as we're born. Little kids imitate like crazy. They do what their parents and their caretakers and siblings do. They don't know any better. They think this is what you should do. And so they're just constantly soaking up the right and wrong thing to do. Cultural influences in the United States, for example, for a long time, racist kinds of influences are there in the culture. They're there in our popular television shows, and well-meaning people who would just be would find it abhorrent and appalled that they were participating in the transmission of these beliefs, yet they still do. It's like we don't realize we're doing it, and so kids are watching this, soaking it up all the time. And the other thing you touched on was your early experience with your parents about the value of money and the work ethic, and what we call here the Protestant work ethic. The Calvinist kind of idea that you earn your place in heaven by how hard you work on earth. And all of that is ideological and cultural. It's been around in our country, our culture since the 1600s, and it's still very much a part of what makes the United States the way it is today. We soak these things up when we're young. The thing is, if you try, and if your watchers, your listeners will try, very hard for us to come up with a memory of anything before we were 4 years, 5 years of age. Well, that doesn't mean nothing happened all those years. It was a tremendously influential time period on us, on our mind, when we were soaking up the norms and rules, what's right and wrong, everything else, and yet we don't have any explicit memory for it. So those things can influence the rest of our lives. We have no chance at knowing that they're influencing us because we can't remember any of them. So all of that early experience that you get these beliefs that's a great example of how you value money or value whatever it is you value. But that's where they come from. And yet we take them for granted, like they're the water the fish swims in, the air we breathe, without realizing how much of that is really just, in some sense, arbitrary. It's culturally transmitted. It's no absolute right or wrong to it.
In that case, then, so that belief I had about money, I've had to change. And a great resource is speaking to super intelligent people like yourself, John, on this show, and through the show, and hopefully the audience through me get mentoring from people that it'd be very difficult to get access to otherwise. So I feel like people every now and again will say something and it'll stick and I'll remember it and it'll come to me in moments when perhaps that belief has been shaked or rocked, and then I can consciously keep kind of repeating it to myself. So I want to come on to any strategies that are scientifically shown to improve this. Maybe it's visualization or other techniques. We'll come on to that in a second. But before that, he said something really interesting, that children are like sponges. Is there an element to this, like neuroplasticity, where every time I Google this, it seems like the research goes one way or the other of where we have more neuroplasticity as a child than we do as an adult, and then I've seen research that says we have a constant neuroplasticity, and it depends on diet and other things as well. But are things set in stone as a child and more difficult to change when we're adults? Or is it an even playing field throughout kind of our lives with regards to the plasticity of our subconscious?
You're absolutely right. This is an evolving research field, and things do change. And what I might say now might be wrong 5-10 years from now. So the best information we have right now is there's definitely an early plasticity period. And that is where the mind is shaped, associations are developed. We have, our classic, I call them classic, but our studies about holding a cup of coffee, which gives you a feeling of warmth, which then actually extends to feeling warm, metaphorically, towards other people and feeling more trust and generosity towards them and all that, but caused by the physical experience of warmth. Well, that actually comes from our experience as mammals, and all mammals share this, of breastfeeding and being held close to our caretaker. Now, who is our caretaker? The person giving us nourishment, holding us, protecting us, giving us bodily warmth, which is necessary for survival, is also the person we trust and watching out for us. So the idea of physical warmth and social warmth, are actually connected in our actual experience when we're very young, and this is actually true of all mammals that breastfeed. So that's an association. That is a connection that's hardwired actually in all people around Earth, planet Earth, and it comes from our early experience. And that is when our brain is most plastic and forming these connections and associations of what leads to what things go together. And that's the basics for all the new concept and learning we make the rest of our life. It's scaffolded or built on that very early foundation. But they're also talking about a new plastic period. I totally believe this one too. That's around age 13 to 16. And there's this old line that whatever music you like when you're 13 and 14 is what you're going to like the rest of your life. Me, it's Led Zeppelin. It's like that's what 1968, 1969, when it was just hitting and starting. And boy, that's definitely the music I still love today. I yeah, there's some exceptions. You can grow, you can be eclectic and everything. But there is this cultural plasticity period when we're about to leave the nest and go out on our own into the world as individual adults with our own tastes and ability to do what we want. And that's the age 13 to 16. And so that early period of very early infancy, toddlerhood, and then this sort of teenager type period are the two main plastic periods that I know of.
And John, is all this binary? And what I mean by that is, if all mammals feel warm or associate warmth with love, or however we want to define it, is that a yes or no, or are there layers to it all? For example, if we look at our belief of money, do we have a belief on money, or is there 20 beliefs on money, and then our subconscious is programming and batting around all these different, almost like an algorithm to come up with what then bubbles up to our consciousness?
Yeah, well, again, there's at least three good questions that pack into that one question. This is a new field. I think it's fascinating, and it's really the last 10 years maybe, but it's absolutely fascinating, called epigenetics. Now, epigenetics is finding that, well, it used to be that people said you can't pass along acquired characteristics. So if someone has an accident and loses a limb, they don't have children, and then that child doesn't have the limb either. I mean, it's not how it works. But so we used to laugh at theories that said that you could pass along acquired characteristics you acquired in your life. So if I study and get to be smart, does that mean I pass it along for free to my kids? No, that's not how it works. But there is something about early experience. And when you asked about the effect of warmth, physical warmth, and it turns out that it's not there for everybody. And why is that? Well, warmth means you can trust the other person. Well, when you're a little kid, it might be a life or death decision on your part to trust somebody or not. You do have to trust you're helpless. At the same time, you can't just trust everybody, wander off from your parents and trust whoever, might even be an animal. You can't do that. You got to stay close to home and the people who really do have your back. Otherwise, you get eaten and you don't, survive to reproduce. So it turns out that if the mother-child or the father-child bond is not really there, and unfortunately for many kids, that's not. You really can't count on mom or dad to be there when you need them. And unfortunately, there are kids who go through that. By age 1, there's a way of measuring how attached children are bonded to their parent. At age 1, 12 months, that predicts how bonded you are at age 1. They followed these people now into their 20s. They had more friends in grade school. They were more popular in high school. They have fewer relationship breakups in their 20s, all predicted by how closely bonded they were to their parents at age 1. So our attachment and our early learning of can you trust other people based on their first 12 months of life actually is a program within us that tells us we can or we can't trust people later in life. And then it turns out that the warmth priming effect that happens for most people does not happen if the child was not attached to their parent at age 1. So it's like a switch that gets set, but only if you can trust the people around you. And it's adaptive because if you can't trust the people around you at age 1, it's basically saying you can't trust people the rest of your life.
And is that then set in stone? And we can touch on perhaps, I don't know how deep we need to go into neurochemistry and like myelination of different things and that, and repeating a process over and over and over and the feedback loops on it. But is that set in stone? Because that seems like I came, very fortunate. I was brought up with great parents, got 2 brothers, really good family life, all very average and and perfect. So I'm not the best person to dive in too deep into anyone who didn't grow up in an environment like that. But as a kind of a way to wrap up this point here, is this set in stone? Is it what I'm getting at, John, is it set in stone? If so, it's just a case of accepting it and working on it. If it isn't set in stone, how can we change this perhaps?
Yeah, well, it's not set in stone in the sense that it can never be changed, but it is difficult to change it. And then you have all these kinds of therapy issues. Like, for example, people don't change unless they want to change. If they don't want to change, for example, if they are sure they're right that people aren't to be trusted, they're never going to change. And there's, countless books on relationships, countless books on people who are rejecting, who are sure that their partner is having affairs or is about to break up with them, and they break up with them first so that they don't have to wait for the breakup they know is coming. A whole field of relationship science and in psychology is all about people who have these attachment problems, and certainly there's ways to overcome them. So it's not set in stone in the sense that there's never anything you can do about it, but it is difficult, and it really means having to really fight back the gut feelings you have about other people, and the intuitions you have. And I think the one way to do that is for us to realize that these things were going on when we were children, and we just don't know that they did or didn't happen, and so we have to be open to the fact that we might have been shaped or influenced by these early experiences. And to say, you know what, I have to really fight back the feeling I have that I can't trust my partner, that they're going to break up with me. I really have to just really try hard to overcome that. And if they do that, then they're going to have a better chance of longer lasting relationships. But it's like you have this gut feeling, and people trust those gut feelings. If you have a dream that's the day before you go on an airplane trip, and in the dream the airplane crashed, people don't go on the flight. I mean, it's like they trust these intuitions and dreams as if there's some kind of supernatural message, and anything that comes to our mind unbidden. The old days it was like God talking to us, and now we know maybe that's not what's going on. But anything that comes to our mind unbidden is trusted. More than it should be, maybe, but as if it's a message from fate or message from. So when we have these feelings, we can't trust somebody. These gut feelings, they may be coming from when we were 1 year old, and not from this person in front of us at all. And yet, it's very hard to fight that feeling because we tend to trust it and believe it anyway.
Is there any data on whether gut feelings and following that lead to good outcomes? Because in the business world, and I do this as a sales professional, as an entrepreneur, I tend to force myself to follow my gut if it's a 50-50, if it's a coin flip on the scenario. I always tend to go that way. But I am crazy optimistic, and so I could choose not to go with my gut and still put a positive spin on the outcome and have a bias on that. There's probably a name for that bias. I'm not sure what it is. But is there any data on gut feeling leading to kind of better outcomes than just pure data and logic alone?
Yeah. As it turns out, there's a gigantic literature on this. The people who do research on decision making, Daniel Kahneman, who has that Thinking Fast and Slow, huge best-selling book, tells stories about in 1955. That was the year I was born, but in 1955 he was in the Israeli army, and he was involved in figuring out who would be a good leader to be promoted in the army and who not. He was in the psychological assessment unit of the Israeli army in 1955. And he tells this long story of expert judgments being way off, and you really can't trust the intuitions of experts in these fields. And other people, though, for example, who study firefighters, and how is it the firefighter sort of knows what to do when so quickly about how to combat a fire and make sure it doesn't spread. And you put their heads together, and they actually came to some consensus about this. People who have to make these intuitive almost decisions, and they're experts. We have a football player who's a broadcaster now. We just had our Super Bowl here last night. And this ex-quarterback, Tony Romo, is known now for predicting plays before they happen with an uncanny accuracy. And he says the same thing. He says, I'm not thinking, it just is, I see the pattern in front of me. I know what's going to happen. And that's an intuition that he can't really explain, but it's based on his experience. And so what the key seems to be is you can trust your gut if you're an expert with lots of experience, and there's clear feedback to when you're right versus wrong. So when he's predicting a play and it's right or wrong, you can tell, you can see, he knows if it's right or wrong. So he has a feedback loop. The intuitions that don't seem to work out are when experts make them as if they're a clinician saying, oh, this person has these kinds of problems and so forth, without clear feedback if that's really true or not, and on an ongoing basis. So I think we can trust our gut, our expertise, intuitions, if we're in a situation that we do have feedback about what they're being right or wrong. Those are the cases where we can. But I'll give you a case where we can't. And that is, these racist or sexist beliefs that we have from our culture that we soaked up when we were little kids and don't have memories. We think this person is stupid. We think that person's lazy or a criminal or all these things. Those are gut feelings too. Those are intuitions too. And yet we know that they come from culture. They come from in-group, out-group kinds of influences. So, it's not like you can say, oh, we should always trust our gut, or we should say we never trust our gut. But when it's a very complicated situation, like all these cues, like when firefighters know which way to go and how to combat the fire to prevent it spreading, and they have years of expertise and they had feedback that what works and what doesn't, that is something they definitely want to trust their gut, and they do, and they're good at it. But in cases where you're just making assumptions about people without ever getting feedback about, are they really stupid? Are they really a criminal? Are they whatever? You never get that feedback. If you did, and you were a conscientious person, you'd realize that these are bogus and these aren't good intuitions, but they come from our gut because of our evolutionary history.
Well, this seems like, and I might actually do this, and I'll publish it alongside the blog post for this episode, John. Seems like a simple experiment we can do if we are selling on the phone or going meeting people in person. Or every time you make a good decision, just make a note of what the decision was and the kind of A/B of outcome, and just monitor it ourselves. Wonderful. Right? That'd be an interesting experiment to run.
Absolutely, we can all do that. And if we are conscientious about that and do a good job, then we can see. I think you'll see mostly. Here's another example of this. We really think we know somebody, especially from a photograph. We know their personality just from their photograph. It turns out this photographs on faces and so forth are not diagnostic at all. And yet there's this wonderful Princeton psychologist who's written a book called Face Value. His name is Alexander Todorov.
I've spoken to Alexander on the show before. Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay, so his research is incredible. What he shows is that people make judgments of trustworthiness or competence based on just static photographs. And they make them within a tenth of a second after seeing the photograph, and they're the same decisions they'd make if they gave 7 or 8 seconds to looking at the photograph. So we immediately have this sense of competence or of trustworthiness, and yet those judgments predict election outcomes of governor races, Senate races, even in France, in the assembly, and it's crazy because it means that people who are voting are basing their opinions about competence and trustworthiness really only on the face. So that makes no sense. But then you realize over evolutionary time, we didn't have photographs. Mm-hmm. What we had was people in actual action, and doing things in little thin slices of 15 to 30 seconds of how they treated a small child asking for help, or how they looked and helped other people or not. And those 30-second thin slices are predictive and are accurate. Our gut feeling about people when we see them in action, they're pretty good.
So it seems like if we want to translate this to becoming better at B2B sales, the biggest bang for buck, which pulls a lot of this together, is to uncover what our blind spots are. But it also seems like we are terrible at doing that. Is there a process? Is there a way to measure our thoughts, opinions, actions? Or perhaps we need a 360-degree review by other people around us? How would we go about finding out that perhaps we are slightly racist because our dad was a racist, or we've got these biases for whatever reason? How would we suss this out for ourselves?
Yeah, I think that it's clear when a person is not like you, okay, when they're a different group, maybe a different gender. I mean, when they're not like you, to really not trust these gut feelings you have about them until you see them in action, to be very wary about group kinds of effects on you. And that's, people can do what they want in their own life, but I think when they're in a position of power or authority, when they're making a job hiring decision, or they're deciding who gets into a law school or medical school, or they're in control of a person's outcomes, they have to be very, very careful not to let those kinds of potential biases operate. In your own life, I think one thing I've learned in life is not to judge people by their cover at all, to really try to get past that. And I used to do in that 20 years ago some research on internet dating, internet relationships, and this was in the 90s, very crude early days of the internet. And what the research was finding back then was the internet allowing people to join groups with shared interests, common interests, things that they couldn't really find all the butterfly collectors, in the little town in Iowa, whatever, but they could find people who had the same values and interests over the internet, and they tended to want to get together if they were single or whatever, and turns out, people laughed at those internet relationships as it wouldn't survive the first time they see each other in person, but they actually survive longer than face-to-face meetings.
Wow.
They're being formed on a deeper level than a superficial physical attraction, and because of that, they actually last at least as long, and in some studies find even longer, because you're getting past those what we call gating features that often prevent a relationship, friendship, from even starting in the first place, because you don't like the way they look or whatever, not attracted. You don't even get to know them, and so you get to know them, you go beyond that, and a lot of really nice friendships and relationships form because of that. But you have to get past that barrier we've got. We think we know somebody by their cover.
So let's just wrap up the show, John, by flipping this on its head slightly. So other than being probably white, good-looking, chiseled jaw, and in shape, which is stuff I discussed with Alex on that show a little while back, what can we do to give ourselves the best chances of not being flagged up by biases in other people? Is there a way that in B2B sales we want to build long-lasting relationships? For example, with me, deals would take 6 months to 2 years to be put together, selling to the NHS here in the UK. Should we be doing anything, dressing in a certain way, acting a certain way, so that we aren't flagged up by these barriers, so that we can build deeper relationships with people via our kind of subconscious?
Yes, there are some. This is the thing about my book, and I put it all together, and I realized at the end of it, someone asked me for some life hacks, like these New Year's resolution kinds of magazine articles. Well, what practical life hack advice can you give? And I went through the book and I went, wow, I came up with 17 or 18, and it wasn't hard at all. And basically because these are the unconscious mechanisms that are inside of all of us. And if you know them, then you can use them. You can make use of them for your own advantage instead of having them randomly influence you. One really great one, it turns out, with interpersonal friendships and relationships, this really relies on meeting somebody in person. Two people negotiating or having a sales meeting or sales call, that kind of thing. When you meet somebody for the first time, I always do this, and it's a bad habit. I'm so worried about what I'm going to say next that I'm not listening to them. I'm so thinking inside about what clever, witty thing I can say to impress them. But I'm not. That means my intention is diverted inwardly, not paying attention to what they're saying. And I often even miss their name, and that's really bad. Like they just told me their name and everything, and I wasn't listening because I was focused on what I was going to say next. Well, we have this thing called natural imitation and natural mimicry. We do that if we're paying attention to somebody. If we're perceiving them, we tend to sort of do the same thing they do with the same facial expressions, the same body language, the same how loud we talk, the kind of level of words we use, and all that. It's just natural. That's part one. We don't have to try to do it. It just happens naturally. Part two is if we do that, the other person likes us better, bonds with us, and thinks the interaction went more smoothly. If you take all of this and put it together now, and those have been tested in department stores and in restaurants with higher tips, greater sales, if the salesperson or waitress just mimics back the person's order or what they're saying, those simple things increase customer satisfaction. They increase sales by 20%. These are large-scale French department stores and so forth and so on. We know they work, but why do they work? They work by the following mechanism. All you have to do is look at the other person. You don't try to do anything, just look at them, because if you look at them, what they do is coming into your senses, you're perceiving them. That naturally causes you to do the same thing back in a very subtle way. Tone of voice, nonverbal expression, body posture, facial expression, all these things. They see that, and then they like you more, and they bond with you more. And actually, this is actually being used in law enforcement now. It's nice because we have a former FBI director who became famous named James Comey, who was fired by President Trump, and then wrote a book about a higher value or a higher calling. And he talks about his days in the FBI, and he says, torture, waterboarding, that stuff doesn't work. It doesn't give you real information. The person's just trying to tell you anything to stop the torture. He said what works is rapport. What works is establishing rapport. And what establishes rapport the easiest is just watching, paying attention, taking the other person seriously, treating them with respect, listening to them, because then you do all those natural things back that causes them to notice, hey, you're like me. You react in the same way. You're acting like I do. You're doing the same things in a very subtle. So that mechanism alone is worth so much. And it's so simple. I tell my students in my classes this: you meeting somebody for the first time, just look at them. Look at them and pay attention to them. Everything else will follow. It's an automatic, natural, evolved mechanism you can put to your advantage.
This is one of the reasons why I'm hesitant. I get pitched a lot from people who are body language experts, people worked with the FBI, trained the FBI, and all these kind of things. I'm always hesitant to have them on in case they go through a list of when they cross their legs, you cross yours, or you do this with your arms and wave them around in the air, and it'll be like some kind of magical spell. When I feel, this is a gut feeling, so I should jot this down whether it's accurate or not, but I feel like what you're saying is easier, less weird and manipulative, and seemingly works. Because I know when I consciously catch myself just in a great conversation, we're kind of going back and forth and mirroring and doing all these weird hacks and techniques organically, right?
Yes, exactly. And it's the worst thing you can do is try. Because then it's like Darwin said about emotions and emotional expressions. Yeah, we can fake an emotion, but we don't do a very good job. It's only when really experiencing emotion that all these expressions and the signs of that emotion come out naturally. It can be faked, but it's not a good idea. People are very quick to notice, and we're not really, most of us, very good actors or actresses, and we can pull it off. The best thing to do is just let the mechanism work for itself.
And just even on that final point, we'll wrap up with this, John, of a lot of actors and actresses put themselves in the position of the person they're trying to emulate, right? They're not going, oh, this individual would wink or move their face. They're trying to be that individual and let it all happen. That sounds quite wishy-washy and hippie, but they're trying to let the emotions go through them as opposed to trying to copy them.
Yes, this is. I used to, when my daughter was very young, she loved Sesame Street, and she loved Elmo, right? The little red monster, Elmo. Well, Elmo had a friend named Zoe, and Zoe was trying to teach Elmo to be a duck, walk like a duck, quack like a duck, and it was just too much for Elmo to handle, too many different things to do at the same time. And Zoe says, no, you're doing it the wrong way. Just think to yourself, Elmo is a duck. Elmo is a duck. And so from inside out, if you think of yourself as being a duck, all the other stuff just naturally follows. You don't have to try to do each individual thing. So the way to really be something is, the method in acting, the method approach to method acting is to become the character inside, then all the other superficial signs just flow really naturally and easily. So if you can take the other person's perspective, really talk yourself into a state that you're on their side, that you want what's best for them, it'll all come out very genuinely.
And final thing on this. I think I've said final thing about 15 times, but I'm loving the conversation. But genuinely, the final thing on this, is there any data on, essentially what we're talking about here is potentially is faking it until you make it. If I know I want to be an incredible sales professional in 5 years' time from now, and I want to shortcut the process, is it possible to emulate someone, to put up myself in their position, to think like them, act like them, dress like them, have an environment like them? If they have a clean desk, I have a clean desk. Is there any data on that actually being effective other than kind of anecdotally?
I don't know, anecdotally, sure, but not data that I've seen. I mean, I've heard of actors and actresses, really living in the town, trying to be the Amish person like Harrison Ford did once, and try to really, so it's inside of them. They can call on their internal memories and experiences to generate the actual genuine behavior. I think that's a really good idea. The one thing that we all know when people will follow you or not is the confidence that you exude. And so if you really believe in yourself and believe in what you're doing from inside, not just superficially, I think people sense that you're committed. People who are minority groups in societies often have a big impact on the majority, and they've traced it to the fact that the majority thinks, they must really believe in what they're saying because they're putting up with, S blank, blank, blank all the time from everybody else, and they're enduring hardships, getting bitten by guard dogs. They must really believe in what they're doing. And so, otherwise they wouldn't do it. And so the confidence and the belief and the certainty and and that you exude by having it come from inside out, I think will have a huge impact on your relationships professionally and personally.
Love it. Well, I will, and that's a good point to wrap up on. I think confidence is contagious. I think when if there's a leader in the room, way beyond kind of my skills as a teacher, you probably experienced this. When people look up to you and you've done the work and you can show and prove a point and you can teach people something, people are drawn and kind of magnetized towards you. And I think if you can set yourself up as a sales professional, and we talk about it all the time, it's almost cliche that you should be a consultant, you should be teaching people about not just your product, the competition's products, the positioning within the market, how you can help your customers and how they can help their customers through you, all this good stuff. I feel like that does lead to a more charismatic and a magnetic conversation. And with that, John, I've got one final question, mate, and this is something I ask everyone that comes on the show. So I appreciate you're not a quote-unquote salesperson, but everyone has to sell ideas, research, funding, grants, whatever it is, every now and again. So I'm going to ask you regardless. So that is, John, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Oh, better at selling. I would say think about what the other person's goals are, what they're doing, and try to adopt that same goal. So the things you say and do are going to be in line, and the goods and bads and so forth are going to be in line with what they're thinking goods and bads are. Can I give you a real quick example?
Of course,
yeah. I get letters from, I'm trying to find somebody to repair my gutters, or whatever it is, and I get the letter back. It's all about how how they'll only take payment in this certain form, and it has to be this and it has to be that, and if it's a check, it has to be. The whole letter is all about making sure they get their money, and I'm turned off by that because I want somebody that's their focus, that their goal is to make sure that what my gutters are repaired, that they work, they don't leak, and it's quality, and that I'll be happy and satisfied with what they do. If I get that sense, then I want them. But I don't want somebody who leaks in what they say, what their real goals are, just make sure they get their money. And I think these things leak out without our realizing it because we're not aware of what's going on. If we really focus on the other person's goals and take their perspective, what is it they want, and have that be our goal too, I think things will be just so much better.
Well, from a non-salesperson, that's some of the best sales advice I've ever heard. That ties up everything that we talked about in the show, wraps it all up nicely, and I really appreciate that. That's a really interesting, and with your spin on it, a really unique insight. So with that, John, tell us, we've touched on the book, but tell us a little bit more about the book and where we can find out more about you as well, sir.
Sure. I am on LinkedIn. My name is John, and Bargh is Bargh. My book is Before You Know It. It came out in 2017. It's available on Amazon and in fine bookstores everywhere. Not maybe every airport bookstore, but big bookstores. I have an Amazon author page. Again, my name, John Bargh. My research is on a Yale website called Acme Lab, acmelab.yale.edu, and we put up our papers for everybody if they going back to the 80s if they would like to read more about the research. But the Facebook page Before You Know It is where I put new things, where I'm giving talks, things like that, sort of to keep people who are interested in the book up to date on what's going on. And that's pretty much it.
Perfect. Well, I'll link to all of that to everyone who's interested and wants to learn a little bit more. And of course, I cannot promote the book enough after this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I'll link to all that in the show notes to this episode over at salesman.red. I nearly forgot the URL myself then, John. And with that, mate, I want to thank you for your time, your insights. I want to thank you for coming on a sales show as a non-sales expert. I appreciate the kind of leap of faith there, if there was one. And I want to thank you again for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you, Will, very much for having me.